looking at hip hop news, and I saw something that really, really caught my eye. It was a news article about Andre 3000's flute album not counting towards his record label contract. I'm going to read through this real quick. Andre 3000 has revealed that his long-awaited debut solo album New Blue Sun doesn't actually count towards his contract with Epic Records. The Outkast legend shared the startling revelation in an interview with journalist Toure. Shout out to Toure, that's the homie. Admitting that he initially didn't understand why that was the case and even attempted to circumvent the clause. They congratulated me on the process. They congratulated me on what the work was. But contractually, it's very interesting. My label will not count this album against my contract. This is as a solo artist, he said of his polarizing flute project. I wonder how he felt about them calling it polarizing. After his lawyer explained to him the stipulation that prevents New Blue Sun from being acknowledged by Epic, however, Three Stacks said he has come to realize why it belongs in his contract and that of any recording artist, apparently. I guess he's talking about the clause in his contract that prevents it from being counted by the label. I didn't understand it at first, and we tried to find ways around it, but I understand it in a way too, he continued. My attorney explained it in this way. It was invented in the 70s, maybe, when artists were trying to get out of their deals, so they were just pretty much turning in anything. And so you have to have some type of legal stipulation that stops you from doing that. It's something where it says the next recording has to be 90% like the recording before it. You see what I'm saying? It's in everybody's deal. They don't know it because most people are not doing this kind of thing. The other reason they don't know it, this is me interjecting here. The other reason they don't know it is because these contracts are really thick and nobody reads them all. There's so much boilerplate language that your eyes glaze over and start to bleed. And there's a bunch of stuff in there, this odd, weird, outdated language that they just been putting in contracts for years. And even the lawyers aren't going over them saying, line this part out. Back to the article. It stops you from turning in 10 tracks of hand claps and saying, this is my album. And I get it. But Sylvia and the team, I don't know who Sylvia is. They've been so supportive. They know I'm not turning in a hand clap back. They get it. But as a business, this is the stance that they took. Andre 3000 admitted that he isn't stressing over the setback and is in no hurry to leave the label, but still wishes New Blue Sun, which is nominated for Album of the Year at the 2025 Grammys, would have counted towards his contract. I'm not like, let's hurry up and get out of this deal. Wink, wink. I want to put out this rap album. No, I don't have a rap album. None of that kind of shit, so I'm not stressed about it, he said. If I get out of the deal, it is what it is. I may want to stay there, but I wish it would count. It's interesting news that artists should hear that this new album is not counting. ATLien also confirmed to Toure that he's working on another album, but didn't say when it will be released or what it will sound like. So this is so fucking interesting to me. Oh, for sure, he replied when asked about a follow-up project that's in the works. At this point, I'm just trying to keep the momentum. There's a such thing as creative momentum. The next stuff is very interesting too. We're almost a third or halfway into it. So this is really interesting to me. And the first reason I thought it was very interesting is because when this album was announced and I was trying to make sense of it, like I knew Andre played the flute, right? Like there had been reports of people running into Andre 3000 with a flute on the street for like 3 years before this album was announced. To me, it didn't make sense that as much as people bug him for a rap album, as much as he's always in this discussion for one of the rap greats, why he would come out with the flute album. And in my trying to make sense of it, I did have the thought that maybe he was putting out this album to help him get out of his contract. I would assume that Outkast has probably been on the same contract they've been on since they signed to LaFace Records in the 90s. And they're on Epic, and I know, yes, they're on Epic. This Flute album came out on Epic. So my assumption is that it's the same deal. Now, the first thing he said up here was that they congratulated me on the process. They congratulated me on what the work was, but contractually, it's very interesting. My label will not count this album against my contract. This is as a solo artist. So the difference that he's saying and what made it count or not count in that sense was that it's as a solo artist. But I sense that if he had put out a rap album, that they would have counted it. Beezy, what up? I would assume that they would have counted it if he put out a rap record. I feel like in his position, there's probably a lot of pressure to put out a rap record. And I would be willing to wager that when he does do that, he might want to do it on a fresh new record label situation. I imagine with the Outkast label deal situation, there's a lot of money tied up in that. Because if you notice, there was a lot of money spent even promoting this album, which is another reason I thought that this was going to apply towards his deal and probably help him get out of his contract. Because they were using Epic, Sony, because Epic is under Sony. They were using Epic level resources to promote this album. I mean, and you can tell also since it got nominated for Album of the Year that Sony Epic is using Sony Epic label lobbying with the Grammy committee to make sure the album got recognized. So it stands to reason if they were going to use all of the same resources to create, promote, push the album, that it would count. And it's interesting too, because he's saying at the end of this that he wasn't necessarily trying to get out of the deal with it. But he's also saying that he was surprised to learn that the album wasn't going to count. And to me, what that says is that he made it thinking that it would. So I think it's probably a little disingenuous to say that that wasn't part of his thought process at all. So he got surprised to learn that it didn't count. And that resonated with me too, because I have learned as a recording artist, you can do a lot assuming that it'll go a certain way business wise, but you don't realize till you're done that it won't go that way. Like I can remember when I was with Mellow Music Group, you know, we had a deal for a certain amount of albums or whatever. Then when I make an EP and put it out, I'm thinking, oh, so this either counts in the deal somehow, or there has to be a new deal made around it. And, you know, in the position I was in, considering I didn't know anything, I'd, you know, just go through making it, giving it to them and putting it out. And then, you know, it turns out my biggest song that I ever made is on an EP that we never really had any particular paperwork around. And I didn't really understand that until like years later, because I was just going through, basically, I was just assuming that it was going to work out a certain way based on how the last project had worked out. But it's very easy to do that because, like I said, these contracts are on a lot of paper. They're on a lot of paper. And there's a lot of boilerplate language in it. A lot of heretofores and therewise and a lot of madness that, you know, nobody's really trying to make sense of. They're just trying to look at the numbers. They're just trying to look at the number of albums. They're trying to look at whether or not it's in perpetuity, or if it gets or if the rights get turned back to the artist at a certain point. They're trying to look at what the budgets are. Like, what is the record label saying that they're willing to pay to invest in these projects? But one thing you might not be looking at is this small paragraph that says every album has to sound like 90% of the album in front of it. There's a lot of trickery that ends up afoot. I was looking, this made me want to look at Outkast record label situation, and I found this interesting article from 14 years ago. This is when Big Boy put out the Sir Lucius Left Foot album, and Jive Records, which was Outkast's previous home, was trying to block Def Jam from releasing the album because the album had 3 songs that had Andre3000 on it. So Jive was trying to say that those 3 songs, because they had both Big Boy and Andre on them, were technically Outkast songs. And they tried to block its release. And the wild part is, in this article, it also says that at one point he had turned in this album to Jive to put out, and they called it a masterpiece. And then they said they didn't know what to do with it. So they gave it back to him to take somewhere else and try to see if he can get put out. They could have put it out themselves. They had the opportunity to put it out themselves. They gave it back to him. He gets a deal for it at Def Jam, and then they try to block it based on 3 Andre3000 features that they already knew was on it because they had it first. And then from from LaFace Records to Jive Records, somehow through Sony reshuffling, now the original Outkast contract is on Epic Records. And Andre3000, all these years later, put out a flute album that is nominated for Album of the Year, but somehow does not count for an album under this old ass deal. It's wild to me, but legally he's still there. He's still stuck. I mean, who knows how many more albums were left? I mean, this is a huge act signed to majors. They had released, 6 albums already? 5 albums already? They might have had one of those classic old school 10 album deals or something. And obviously Big Boy's albums didn't count because they didn't put them out. And so it's very likely that these 2 superstars are under the same contract they signed in the 90s. Alvin's Hot Juice Box, does the label still profit from it? Yeah, the label still paid for it to get made. The label still paid for it to get manufactured, promoted, all of that. So it's not like, yeah, they should definitely get whatever their legally agreed upon share is for this album. I just think it's wildly unfair that the album doesn't count as him having submitted an album to get him closer to being free from that deal. Like, that's whack to me. I don't know where this ends up with him. I hope that he ends up happy both creatively and business wise. I will say that. But it sucks to see the amount of fuckery that an artist has to deal with, even at the level that he's at. Like and subscribe, homie, friend. It's free. Stop playing.